great.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. Tell us, you're currently president at Little Brown and Companies. Stella, tell us a little bit briefly about yourself, your family, where you're located. I see Radio City Music Hall in the background.
I
Wonderful
always say
backdrop.
this is my one flex. With our, I always try to angle because it's pretty cool to be across the street from Radio City. So we try to brag when we can. Otherwise, this is a very corporate looking, gray walls office. So yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome.
Uh,
Yeah, tell us a little bit about
well,
yourself, your family. How long have you been in New York now?
oh wow, that's a good question. I moved here in 1998. So, which seems like just yesterday, but and I'd done West Coast publishing for a few years before I came. I was too scared to move to New York at the time. Born and raised in LA, I didn't know a single soul in New York. I wanted to be in publishing, but I was just certain that, the city would eat me up alive. So I did West Coast publishing for as long as I could. So yeah, it's been, but I will say as a Los Angelino, every summer here is like a shock to the system. Like I did not grow up with humidity, so every summer it's like this again. You would think after all this time, but in fact, no, it's still kind of, which I guess keeps it fresh for me. But
That's awesome.
yeah, but yeah, so
You've had a varied career uh, at all five big fives over the last, what, 3 decades. Share a little bit of your journey from intern and now to Little Brown, which is, you've been over there over a year now, right, Sally?
yeah, a year and 4 months. So I basically actually, oh my gosh, I missed it. It was last month was my 30th anniversary in publishing. I mentioned, born and raised in LA, went to UCLA. I thought I was going to be a journalist and realized that I am not cut out for writing. So publishing was a little bit of an accident in that way. And I won't bore you with the story on how I found publishing in that way. But for me, when I really, and it came late in my life, I was in college where I really kind of put two and two together, like, oh, there's a whole industry. There are people who touch the book that I'm holding. Many, many hands go into the book that I'm holding now in front of me. So going backwards, I really did sort of discover, okay, I think editorial is probably, when people think of book publishing, they think of, editors with their feet up with a martini, like editing books, quietly all day. But getting to this point was a lot sort of I took a very kind of crooked path, and in that way because I was scared to move to New York, my first job was actually working for an agent down in San Diego, Sandy Dykstra, the famous Sandy Dykstra.
Yeah.
And at the time, she was one of the few people outside of the New York area publishing, on the publishing side, agents, et cetera. I mean, really, the heart of it was still very much centered in New York. But so it was a great first job to have because it's a great crash course in publishing. You see from, her from an agent signing an author, working on proposals, sometimes 1, 2, 3 years, in the making before it even lands on the desk of an editor. But really through the life cycle of it. And also it was a great overview of the industry because we dealt with from her perch, we dealt with all of the publishers, big, small, academic, et cetera. So it really gave me a sense of kind of what the world was like, but also kind of what I thought where I wanted to be. But because I was still kind of not ready to move, I then took a job at Harper San Francisco, which now is called Harper One, but at the time was the West Coast office of HarperCollins, really specializing in spirituality and religion publishing and religious publishing. And it was not quite I would say I didn't have a strong affinity for the books, but I took the job because I wanted to learn how to be an editor. And it was actually a great first editorial job because it was outside of the fray of New York, but it was part of one of the big five. I learned a lot about just the editorial process, per, you know, transmitting a manuscript, doing art logs, you know, had a copy of the Chicago Manual of Style at my desk, like everything just, it was a really nice, and I realize now in hindsight, a very isolated time to really learn the nuts and bolts. Yeah. I always quote Jacques Pepin, who's one of my favorite, chefs, is like, I remember hearing him talk once about like how he got to be a great chef. He said, it's like, I just cut 10,000 onions. Like I had to learn how to do the rote work of being a, a cook and a chef. And I thought, in many ways, this is such an apprenticeship job, publishing and particularly in editorial, that you really have to just know how to make a book, literally the process of, like the front matter, the back matter, what a signature is, and, all the million steps that go into the finished product. So, but then at a certain point, I said, I want to publish a novel. That would be so great. My goal was I just wanted like acquire and edit one novel. And so in order to do that, I had to move to New York.
And that was Jillian was your first?
No, I had a few before that, but I did move.
Breakfast runs.
Yeah, at that point, I moved over to the New York office of HarperCollins, and I remembered starting, and I was like, "What was the big deal? I should have just moved here from the start." Um, but it was different. It was much more fast paced, and I think in many ways, I look fa fondly back to my like the first few years in California, where I think I did. I did come in a little bit with more, a little bit under my belt in terms of just a little bit of the confidence of just knowing I knew, just I had mastered, I think, in terms of like an editorial assistant job. And I was ready now to, hopefully acquire. Again, I had the goal of I just wanted to acquire one novel and then I would go back to California. I don't know, I would do something else, but that was 30 years ago, really. And so, but I think to cut the over very quickly, the following 30 years is every role I took at a different house was really geared towards, what am I going to learn differently at this new role, or what maybe I could bring to the table that, adds value. To that role in that position, or that, what the particular imprint is looking for. And so in many ways, when I look back, I think, okay, either I was joining a nonfiction group that wanted to start a fiction program, or I was joining a literary house that wanted to get into more commercial, publishing, or a commercial house I was bringing in a little bit more upmarket fiction. It was interesting how each job, I think in hindsight now, really sort of honed in on kind of particularly, I've now gone on to work on almost exclusively fiction, which is kind of, a nice thing to be able to say that I got to eventually work on my dream books. So I came up, I would say the first 20 years of my career was really solely editorial. Um, acquiring, editing books and working with
Yeah,
authors. And that was, really in many ways, I won't say this in front of, the other departments, but it's really the best job in the house, best seat in the house, really. Um,
that's awesome. Sally, my boss years ago, Steve Rubin at Doubleday, told me that acquiring was blind ass luck.
yeah.
And you have had lots of success with acquiring books. I feel like it's an art. What does acquiring books look like for Sally Kim?
Well, in the old days, or I guess I should say when I was first starting out, a lot of it was just what could I get away with? And I think for young editors, that's really the case because again, I mentioned apprenticeship. It's really true even to this day is that you come up, especially through editorial, working with an editor and you help them, with all the rote tasks, well, I was going to say filing. We don't file anymore. But answering phones and reading behind, when a submission comes in, reading alongside and offering comments, but really you're doing a lot of the support work. But what's so great about that is that what you're doing is you're also learning how it is eventually when you will be acquiring your own books and bringing your own point of view and making a case for why a book should be acquired and adds to the vision of the list. And I'll tell you, like even things like line editing, the way we used to learn is your boss would hand you a book that they either acquired or edited or line edited with you, and you would have to go to the Xerox machine and Xerox that thing before you had to send it off to the author. So you would look and say like, oh, that's interesting, like how they, flipped the order of that sentence, or like why did they delete half this page, and like how did all these things. And you start to like really through osmosis really pick up on a lot of things, including things like, negotiating a contract. You're sitting outside your boss's office, listening to them scream at somebody, duking it out over negotiation, what it's like to be in an auction, all these things you're kind of taking in. But I think in terms of, so in the old days, I would say that was really part of it is that, in your spare time, you would try to kind of make a case for a book that was uniquely something that you thought would add to the overall list, or it would create that space for you at the table and to say, I'm making this up, but like, you're a young editor, working with, some senior editors and you love cowboy westerns and you're working at an imprint that just doesn't have many, but you think, there's a market out there. I know it because I know this inside out. I know every single one that comes out and I know this where people are finding these books, et cetera, and talking about them. And you get one in as a submission or you chase one and you get one in and you say, this is the one, and to make a case for it because you have that sort of expertise that sort of self-anointed, but and so for a lot of young editors and myself included in the early days, that's really how then you start to build a list and you start to build a reputation for a certain kind of book. And that's really, so again, going back to like you see what you can get away with, and that's really, you have to be really scrappy because no one's sitting there saying like, oh, great, you're here now. Like, here's some books you can acquire. It's like you have to go hustle. You have to make relationships with agents, I mean, one of the things I always advise young editors to do is, when you're answering phones for your boss and you're talking to the agent's assistant on the other line, you make a coffee date, talk to them, say, what do you want to, represent as a future agent? And align yourself and kind of see where are your shared, people who share your vision for books that, need to be out there in the world. And so yeah, but so then extrapolate that over many years, you start to build on, some of the early books that I acquired, sometimes did go against the grain of the list, and that was purposeful. Like it wasn't easy to get those across the line. But when you make a success of them, because and you work your tail off to make sure that the book kind of reaches the readers that that are out there, then again, you start to build a body of work. And that's sort of how I would say, relating back to what I was saying earlier about, opportunities that would come up at other houses to say, oh, hey, we see what you're doing over there for Crown, come over, do it here at Harper. We're creating a program. We want you to help shape it. So over time you really start to hone in on what your specialty and your special eye and your affinity for books, and then you do start to build your own luck in that way where agents, projects, authors start to seek you out and say, I want to be edited by the editor who did that book.
Yeah.
And you start to see how you build, and over time that's so I would say the scrappiness never goes away, but you apply that scrappiness to other things
Yeah.
as you come up.
I so resonate with you. I was talking to another agent who was an editor before, and we were just commenting how 20 years ago, 25 years ago, how we got away with our acquisitions. Like we could, just get a scrap of paper and an idea from an author on the West Coast and say, hey, we want to acquire this person. And your boss would say, okay, go buy it, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Now there's social media, there's all kinds of algorithms that wreak havoc. You've said that today's readers show up in different ways than in the past. What identifiers, what are a couple of things you've noticed today in our 21st century, 2025 publishing world that has changed from 20 years ago, even?
So a couple things, and I think it's interesting. I always used to say, "Oh, the market's changing, and and we have to adapt." And things like account behavior, how accounts like Barnes and Noble and you most of some of hopefully all of you remember Borders, for example, like no longer exist. So there are, changes, and also, now looking at, are like just one example is like mass merch accounts, this which didn't exist so much in full force 20 years ago, meaning Target, Walmart, Costco selling books and becoming bona fide booksellers.
Mm.
And so it's forced the publishing industry to obviously kind of change in the way they kind of not just, how they buy, but distribute books and how they work with the accounts. And the elephant in the room, I guess, is also like Amazon hugely has been a sea change in the way we approach our the selling of our books. But I realized by saying the market's changing, that's true. But one thing I realized recently is like, no, actually the readers are actually showing up in a different way. And by that I mean, 20 years ago, that's a great kind of moment to look back on. I think even a group like Little Brown, which is one of the most storied, imprints in the history of publishing here in the States, um, you know, really the role of the publisher was to pick books and anoint them and say, here's a Little Brown book and come and get it. And so we would go and get, try to get the cover of the New York Times Book Review, try to get a nice NPR interview, and you're done. The book would win
Yeah.
some awards, and that's readers are curating their own list now in a very different way. Yes, a nice review is wonderful and it always adds to the way we, are getting visibility for our books. But readers are not just satisfied with like, okay, great, that's the bestseller list. I'm just going to go buy those books, or that's the cover of the Washington Post, book review. I'm going to go buy that book. They're in book clubs. They're listening to Reese Witherspoon. They're on social media. They're following book influencers. They're out in the world. They have Goodreads accounts and they're talking to their friends. And so I love that because it's really kind of, again, the readers showing themselves, but it's made the onus on the publishers a lot different in that we can't just anoint books and say we're going to focus on just really curating a wonderful list. We have to meet the readers where they are. So it's a lot of listening and looking and watching, but also to say, where do those readers convene and where are they getting their recommendations? And so it's in one way, it's made it um, harder in some ways because it makes our job much more focused on the consumer. So it's not just curating lists and courting the reviewers and the book buyers at bookstores and book chains. It's also listening to what readers want and going to them directly. So it's harder, more challenging, but at least there are levers now we can pull in a way that I feel like was you went back to earlier when you said luck. That used to be a huge part of it. You would say like, okay, we've anointed this great debut writer. We're going to send them on a tour for 4 weeks across the country and hope for the best. Now it's, okay, we're A/B testing our digital ads. It's like we're buying, trying to get, the algorithms up on Amazon to try to find the reader who's looking for fun beach read, when they're typing that into the search bar. So there's so many different ways now we can actually get to those readers. It's tireless, and there's so many I would say every few months, it's reinventing itself in terms of the new tricks and ways to get in there. But for example, the last few years, I would say particularly during the pandemic, it really showed itself where these celebrity book clubs, these morning show book clubs that really became very influential. It was a great way to curate a list, but also to get a huge national hit for a book on day one. And so working with the accounts to say, wow, we're going to get this big kind of anointment and to make sure that the books were distributed so that they were ready to buy. And at the moment somebody's holding up on TV, that was a something that became very much a tool for us. And so now again, now you see that everyone's really pushing all of their efforts to get those things. Now that, now there's so many of them, and now it's like kind of, okay, what's the next thing? And one of the things we've been really focused on recently are the book influencers. We call them bookstagrammers. The ones that in the old days they would just, take a photo of a book with their mug of coffee and then like boom. But now it's much more involved. You're seeing a lot of, I'm sure a lot of you follow these really smart, influential people who've created huge followings because they are, they're like the new reviewers now, really. We do court them in the way that we used to traditional media. Books that are catered to their tastes and that add to their branding and their, what their followers want. And it's a great way to kind of, get again back to finding readers where they are.
Yeah, yeah. I've said to many an editor that where they continue to publish in the traditional way, they are publishing as if my mom was still alive, and they need to be thinking about my daughters-in-law who are in their 20s and consume, but they don't consume in the way that my 90-year-old mom would have bought a book, kind of thing. John Van Sloten is here on the call on this Zoom from Calgary, Alberta. And go ahead with your question, John.
Thanks, Sally, for doing this. This is great. And I appreciate your background. I was standing there a year ago for the first time in New York and just loving seeing Radio City Music Hall. Although we can't go there anymore as Canadians until we stop banning everything US from our country. Um,
I know
tell
that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah,
We just got off a meeting where we're talking about the tariffs and how that's affecting our printing. It's just
yeah, what a
there's a
mess.
reality out there that yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway, when you were talking,
go to a nice question. No.
yeah, sorry. Uh,
Sorry, I went to the tariffs. Sorry.
when you talk about sort of knowing in the acquisition process that a book is worth acquiring, I'm interested to know what happens in you. Don and I and have several times reached out to people like you, and what creates the aha moment for you? And are there, and this is probably impossible to answer, any universal traits that define the kinds of books that grab your attention right now, knowing how you see the market?
So it's a really good question. I would say, and sort of an impossible one to answer, but the way I'll answer it is, and the way I've approached now, I'm now I came from PRH recently, so I've been a publisher now of a couple groups, and the role of publisher is a little different in that, I'm working with the marketing, publicity, art, editorial departments and setting a vision for the list. And so one of the ways in which, though, whether I am acquiring some books individually myself, which I will always do because I'm still an editor at heart, but one of the ways that I really feel like I've affected change with these groups is hiring great editors, and particularly not just, editors who I feel have great taste, but they bring something very specific to the list and what we want to do. So most recently I was at Putnam, which was longstanding a very commercial imprint, and we were moving it from kind of the mass market kind of model to more upmarket, kind of a more, I would say the breadth of the list needed to be different because of the market and, mass market changing so much, and the way that you can't anoint books like an author like Tom Clancy in the same way now in today's market for all the aforementioned reasons. But so I did something there where I just hired a bunch of really smart, I hired a nonfiction editor, I hired someone to do women's fiction, and kind of again, editors who had expertise and reputations for a certain kind of point of view for books that they thought and could help kind of again create this larger profile for the list. And what was key about, I think what makes a good publisher is not that to say that you're going to be the market or the audience for every book that that group buys. So absolutely, there were books that we bought as a group at Putnam, for example, where I was like, this book's a little quiet, or this book is, I'm not loving, but that didn't matter as long as the editor had a vision and the group had strengths that played to that vision together, and we made successes of books. And that was really kind of, I think I've worked for some great publishers. I've worked for some other publishers who just didn't literally believe that they needed to love every book that we bought. And that's a very sort of like maybe a small imprint, absolutely, but a large group where you have, again, you're a general trade publisher that you need to be publishing for all people. That's really tough. So I bring that up just to say here at Little Brown, I'm doing a lot of the same thing. I came, a year plus ago and made a lot of changes, and particularly because I knew that we were really not publishing to the best of our experience, and part of that was we needed editors that were publishing into certain categories. Um, so we've brought on a lot of great editors, and the list is literally changing season by season. We're publishing, I would say, into many new categories, but also kind of with a different lens of commerciality of how do we bring that book and connect it to a reader. So that's all background to say, um, you know, what I think editors are, what we're always looking for is that wild look in their eye when they come in the next day and they say, I read this manuscript. I've never read anything like it before, but I know who the reader is, and I know it's a thriller, but it's a different kind of thriller, or it's a memoir, but it's playing with the form, or all these different ways in which. So it's that fire in the belly that I think we're always looking for, and sometimes that isn't. It may be, and there've been so many moments, I would say, in the past, year and a half here with this new group where there's a book that we absolutely will agree together. Beautiful writing, you know, you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this book. It's a story in a category that really works, but we're not going to go after it. And sometimes that is comes down to a chemistry of when you're reading it, but it's also often, I think, the unifying thing has been it's been done before, or what is unique about this book that we feel we need to like shake people by the lapel and say, like, you need to read this book. If it doesn't have that thing that we feel is uniquely us and what, or at least, or I should say, even uniquely what we want a Little Brown Book now to say, when somebody says, I'm pulling a book from the bookshelf and it has Little Brown on the spine, what do we want to already signal with that because of the body of work that we do? And we've decided that it has to be, kind of elevated writing, but also top of class, a book that can also be read 10 years from now, but also kind of does something new to the form and new to the category, whether it's a horror novel, we want it to be a horror novel that plays to it, the forms of the genre, but also maybe has a social justice component, talking about body horrors. It has a feminist, retelling of, something that kind of adds to, why that book should exist on our list and maybe not on a more traditional horror list, for example. Um, Sorry, that was a long and drawn out
Yeah.
answer, but I think that kind of just, we're always looking for that thing that, we want to say. One of the things I often will say to the editors is like, imagine yourself in the launch meeting. And the launch meeting is when we kick off a season and we have the entire sales team in front of us and we present books that we've been working on that we've, maybe acquired 2 years in the past. And imagine yourself in that launch meeting. What are you going to say about this book?
Hmm.
And if you're going to say this is a great crime novel where, it's a great PI who is on his last gig before he retires and like there's nothing new about this book, but it's really solid. Well, that's not going to get the sales department excited about going out to their accounts and saying, this is the book you need to get, you know, buy up in a huge quantity for us to get out there and distribute in a big way. But if you say this is a crime novel that has a time travel element and it's a PI who is traveling through different time periods to chase the one villain that, killed his mother or what, I don't know. I'm making that up, but something that's sort of like, oh, I want to hear more about that. What is that? That's interesting. Those are the books that we're always looking for. Not to say every book has to have a high concept like that, but it helps.
I
Sally,
was
sorry, John. I was
Well,
just,
just a quick comment on
yeah.
just and you in the first part of your answer talked about you're reading it, you have the aha moment, and you know the reader already. And it seems to me that you, given the whole story you've told of how you've gotten to where you are good at knowing that reader, identifying. You have enough experience with which to know that they're out there and that they're looking for something like this. That seems to me an invaluable tool in the process.
I think it helps that we are all readers too in the group. So, in fact, we often, well, when we get in a submission, and an editor is like, we often will all read together. We can't read everything all together, but and sometimes that will be the story in and of itself, meaning like, wow, we've almost focus tested this here. And we have a group of, 10, 12 editors who read across many different categories, but they all agreed this is the memoir of the year or whatever it is, because we're at the heart, the heart of all this, that we're the audience too, collectively. So yeah, I think it's, and sometimes we get it wrong for sure, or I shouldn't say we get it wrong, but sometimes it's just the elements, the circumstances. It was the wrong month, or there was another book on the same topic, or there was an election, or whatever it is, will kind of eventually there is an audience for every book. It's just it's sometimes our gauge as to is like, do we feel like there's a large enough audience? And and whatever the answer to that question is, do we know how to reach that audience, specifically Little Brown? And if another publisher can reach that audience better, then maybe we're not the best publisher for this book. And yeah, that's a hard test, but it's one that we have to apply a lot.
Thank you.
Sally, Rachel was asking, you're looking at a screen of authors here. When you acquire an author, what is a characteristic or characteristics that you want an author to show or exhibit that really will help them be successful as an author with Little Brown specifically, or even a publisher?
Yeah. So it's what's interesting now is that I also, as much as we've been focusing on the role of the publisher, I think the role of the author has changed a lot. In the old days, you could be Thomas Pynchon and write a great book and just never leave your house, and that would be fine. It's harder now. It's not impossible, but it's so um, in many ways because of this now direct relationship with the reader. Readers in the old days, I remember working for part of your job as an editorial assistant was forwarding author mail. So, if somebody, a reader would read a book and had a comment or praise or whatever, they would literally write a letter, type it up, whatever, put it in an envelope and mail it to the publisher. We would forward all that stuff over. Now it's a DM. It's like, a reader will say like, I follow you on Instagram and I have a quibble with you. And the, the expectation of the market now for writers is very high in terms of like, and you need to answer me and you need to answer me in the way I want it. And so I'm realizing that too. Yeah, we put a lot on the writers now to be the face of their books, to be kind of have the lived in experience of the books that they're writing. Um, and so yeah, they don't have to be, but it really helps when they're visible and they're out there and they're interacting and they not only go on tour, but they're, posting about their process. And, if you're writing a book about fly fishing, it would really, really help if you're a fly fisherman, I would say, to say like, oh, and and to do, off the book pieces about that in interviews and finding those like that audience in that world. So often now what we do is before we buy a book, I mean, I remember in the old days, I keep saying that. I feel like I'm so old when I in the old days. Um, there were books that I actually bought before I even talked to the author. I can't believe that that happened. And picking up the phone and saying, "Hi, I'm your new editor." That actually used to happen. That is never happening now. We always have a phone call. Now it's a Zoom. It's great if we could actually have an in-person meeting where we actually meet to make sure that we have shared vision for the book,
Mm.
but also that we kind of, it's like dating before you get married. Like you do talk about, we bring, our strengths to the table and talk about how we're going to publish the book. And, um, but the author also tells us, kind of what's their backstory? What do they bring to the table? Why do they write this book? What's their vision? What do they want to get out of this? And how are our visions aligned? Do we see the book in the same way? Because that's half of the recipe for success. If you have different visions for the book and you're kind of getting into this big, long relationship, and you have different goals, and that's sort of a recipe for disaster. So, but in that way, I would say we really get a good sense of not only how is this author going to be to work with, but what is their, do they, all they care about is getting on the New York Times bestseller list? Great. Or they don't care about the bestseller list. They really want to make sure that nobody touches the integrity of the books. And so I'm not going to, change that storyline, or, I'm not going to make the villain this way or that way or whatever it is. That's important to know because we will be road testing this stuff and we will be kind of pushing to say, okay, look, we feel maybe this cover should, feature. We have an issue right now with an author who like really does not is very allergic to having a figure on his covers. But he's writing in a category where a lot of the readers need a figure. I'm talking in very vague terms, so you don't figure out who I'm talking about. But um, so that's an interesting challenge, right? Because it's like we know as much as we want to reflect the integrity of the book and be accurate to the book and be 100% behind the author's vision for the book. We also, our jobs is to sell the book and to connect the book to the reader. So there's certain things that we know because we've been doing this for a long time, and that's our jobs, is that there's certain things that we know we need to at least bring to the table and say, what would really help is if we had a figure on the book to just signal for the readers who are looking for that that's important. So anyway, that's my, again, sorry, I'm a little long-winded, but my long-winded answer to say for authors, it's often what we're looking for in that initial call in those meetings is really a willingness to work with us and to be mindful that yes, we want them to have a very strong vision for their book and be firm in that, but that there are going to be, this is also kind of a, we're the book experts, so we're going to be, you know, inviting a collaboration on a lot of things. And sometimes it will be sometimes things that may not make sense or may seem like it's kind of a new thing that it had never occurred to you, but are kind of important configurations to how we publish a book and get it into, kind of maximize, whether it's for the accounts or booksellers or whatever, even down to the timing of the book.
Mm.
When we publish, like these are all things that I don't want to say it's a science, but we have, we do have some strong data that, backs up a lot of the decisions we make.
Sally, one of the questions here from Jesse is, it seems like a hurdle for debut novelists to break into the traditional publishing world with so many established authors. Um, can you comment to that? What's the difference today? You know, to the old days, you could break in a debut author from Whitefish, Montana, with no social media, et cetera, et cetera. It was a good story. What's the challenge with debut authors versus the established ones now?
Um, it's interesting. It kind of can go both ways, actually. That
Hmm.
you always hear about the huge auction for the debut writer who wrote this singular book and all the publishers in town wanted it. It's actually kind of a good seat to be in to be a debut author because you are completely coming in with a fresh slate. So one of the questions you had earlier when you said, in the old days you could like buy a book over lunch or whatever, or scrap a piece of paper. Now we can't do that because first of all, we're owned by media corporations. There's been a lot of consolidation in the industry. We have to run P&Ls, profit and loss statements. We also the book scan, which is like the Nielsen rating type of thing for book sales, cash register sales. So now we have access to data, and everybody does in a way that wasn't a thing before. You would literally have to wait for your royalty statement to figure out how many copies you sold. Now you know every day to the hour how many copies have been taken to the cash register and sold. So these are all things that now publishers are using to kind of try to make more calculated guesses about what they're investing in and the books they're investing in. So if you're an author on your sixth book and every book has kind of, trickled down in terms of sales, that does affect the way your value. And I'm just speaking plainly here. I know that, none of this is new to you, but it is a way in which we do have to assign some value and kind of come to that. Not solely, but that is one of the markers. And so a debut writer, sometimes I would say, because there's no track, there are no book scan numbers on any of your previous works that are hidden in your drawer. Publishers love nothing more than a fresh start, and especially if it's coupled with a singular book, a story that no one's ever told, that comes with a great backstory, and just and on top of that, it's just an excellent book, and a book that a publisher can really assign a certain vision to how they're going to publish it in a very specific way. Um, it can be actually an absolutely wonderful seat to be in. And in fact, having talked to a lot of and published a lot of debut writers, but talking to a lot of writers, those calls are really kind of fascinating, where often they're just overwhelmed by, look, I was writing this book for 5 years and alone in my mom's basement, and here I am talking to every single, editor at every single house who just clamoring to publish it. It's a very interesting kind of, I think situation to be in. But yeah, but I will say, so now flipping the coin on the other side, it is because of all the aforementioned things about like how people are getting the word out and how people are discovering books and discoverability being so different. In the old days, you would go to a Borders and you would go to literally a shelf that said bestsellers, and then, which was, by the way, space that publishers would pay for. And then you'd say, yeah, I'll buy that new Tom Clancy. Much easier back then. Now it's like if you're an up and coming Tom Clancy writer writing military thrillers, how do you get the word out? And so I will say, yes, it's in this world, established brands, even though that world is changing a lot because of the way accounts are buying books and distributing them. It is kind of, and we saw this during the pandemic. A lot of the book sales were hugely up, as you all probably heard. Print sales were up, but interestingly, of books that were already working, of brand names that were already familiar to people who were stuck at home, largely a lot of them, buying these books on Amazon and saying like, oh yeah, that I know that book, I know that experience, I'm going to buy more of that. So yeah, it is tough, but I think it makes it all the more imperative for publishers to figure out how do we gauge success now. Yes, selling a lot of copies of the book and making your investment back, absolutely. But I do think that, and that's a dual purpose of publishers now, and what I'm trying to bring at Little Brown, which is, yes, we want to make sure we make our numbers and our budget and all of that, but that we're also, my gauge of success right now is, are we publishing to new readers that we weren't reaching before, in this with this new team and these new books we're buying? To me, that's success because that's making a well-rounded general trade imprint, first of all, but it's also setting us up, for sustained success in that, like, I'll give you one example. A few years ago, I remember like suddenly witch books were really hot. Witch books, books about witches. Um, and I was at PRH at the time, and I remember there was this like just it was a 8 month period where like everybody was just like, everybody look in the backlist. Do we have any witch books? Can we repackage them and get them back out in the marketplace? And there were certain imprints that like, yeah, we publish these witch books, we'll do that and that, the other thing. But it was fascinating to watch because and that's just one example of so many, but to say witch books were always, horror books were always around, but that suddenly that became because it was in fashion. Now, if a group like Little Brown, for example, if we're publishing, the goal is to publish in all categories and for all readers, in our way, and in the way that, I've mentioned before about, whether it's elevated writing or being the best in class in it. Um, but when the light shines on a category, we should be there and ready with the books already, and not just books that we're publishing, next week,
Yeah.
but books we published 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And to me, that's a a, a marker of success that I want us to get to. And um, so yeah, I think it's as much as it is hard to be a debut writer in the sea of what seems to be so many best-selling authors. If you have a unique story to tell and you're creating, let's say, a new genre, or creating, helping a publisher grow more robustly into a genre they want to invest in, you can absolutely find a wonderful career that way. But finding the right partner who's going to be there with you all the, is key. So that's going back to that phone call, back to that shared vision is really important.
Sally, fiction or nonfiction? What's your preference? I think I know the answer, but how do you approach both in different ways?
Personally, I love to acquire novels, and that's just, Mac Barnett is probably one of the very few. I've done like one hand I could count the nonfiction books I've acquired personally. But I have always worked with groups that are general trade. So like Little Brown, we're exactly 50-50 fiction and nonfiction. In fact, we have two very robust nonfiction imprints that specialize in even more so nonfiction. I would say very broad strokes. What's different is also the approach in which how we publish them. So nonfiction is, as much as it always counts, how the words on the page land, but it's very subject driven. So, and thinking again, talking about account behavior and how that's changed, thinking about, okay, a nonfiction book for where, unless it's a literary memoir or something like that, for the most part, we're thinking about, okay, that reader is going to that section in the bookstore, or they're also going online and they're typing in certain keywords, best book on chess strategy.
Mhm.
So it does affect the way we position the book, what we put on the cover, what the description act literally reads, the title, those things could become very, very important in terms of just getting into that algorithm, getting into that, trying to get that book in front of you. More, there is a rotating statistic, but most books are bought online now. Yeah, very we crossed that line many years ago, but I would say three-quarters of the books roughly are bought online, whether it's a print book, ebook, audiobook, whatever, but bought not in a bookstore. So that's pretty remarkable. And
Mm.
so that affects the way how we position the books and how we, try to get it in front of that reader who literally needs to know what they're looking for when they get into that online bookstore. They can't just be like, well, they can, and obviously the online retailers are trying very, you know, in a big way, trying to merchandise their bookstore pages to make it like a browsing experience. But for the most part, it's really hard. So getting that, so that's very specific to nonfiction. Fiction, there is a level of that as well. If you're looking for beach read, rom-coms, cli-fi, that's climate science fiction, by the way. Romantasy, there are ways in which we can kind of, again, zero in and target that reader. But if you're just looking for a well-written book that makes you feel things, that's I always say the hardest book to pitch, but the ones I love the most are the ones that you say, well, you just have to read it. Impossible to pitch that kind of book. But those end up being the ones that I've loved the most publishing, or like, oh, this is the pitch is this, but it's actually this. Like those are the hardest books, but that also means that, okay, that means that book hasn't existed before. So that makes it, even more reason to kind of try to get it in front of as many people as you can. But so that's how we approach it very differently, in that we need the tastemakers, we need the bookstagrammers, we need the book clubs, we need the reviewers, we need, we need to court the book buyers at Barnes and Noble and Amazon and Target and all the independent bookstores to read that book in galley form 8 months before it's published, buzz about it, get that buzz going, and then anoint it and kind of pass the baton so that by the time that book is published and you, a reader, are walking into your local indie, it's sitting right there in the front because the book buyer has that great shelf talker that says, this is the best book I read this year because, or if you loved Lessons in Chemistry, you'll love this book. Like we want that kind of marketing already coming at you organically. So that's very different from, let's say, a strategy book on chess. So anyway, I those are very broad strokes, but that's kind of, I would say, how I would just differentiate the two.
This has been fun. Sally, you have a wealth of information. I want you to know that one of our today's attendees is going to get two of your recent Little Brown books, The Gift of Not Belonging and
Oh,
The Uproar. From
great.
So one of you will have your name picked. Um, Before we go, I want to always respect our time uh, constraints and appreciate you joining us, Sally, and your busy schedule. You've got a screen full of writers, both fiction and nonfiction. Um, in an earlier email correspondence to you, I indicated I had heard you speak so beautifully about your dad and how he gave you words of wisdom as you headed off into the publishing adventure. What words of wisdom do you have, Sally Kim, for these writers?
Wow. That's a tall order. I would say I would kind of how it links back to just the last 30 years for me. There were so many times especially in my early days coming up in publishing, where I thought, well, there's that publishing industry and there's the one I'm in, meaning, a kind of an anointed group of gatekeepers or tastemakers or whatever, that I'm not going to those fancy parties. I didn't go to an Ivy League. Back in when I was coming up, like all the assistants went to Ivy League schools and like had aunts and fathers who were in the industry who got them jobs. Like I definitely did not fit the mold. And there were many times where I thought, you know what, who knows what's going to happen with me here. And so in many ways, I think sometimes it's a miracle I'm still here. It actually is a miracle I'm still here, but there was a shift. And I think that it's a reflection of the industry changing and again, the market changing and readers and just everything and the culture changing in society. And where absolutely my going against the grain and having my perspective became my superpower. That became the reason why I was chosen for a certain job or, you know, absolutely, I would say 10 years ago, I would not have fit the profile of a Little Brown publisher. I just wouldn't. And the fact that I was hired for this is kind of a very interesting or revolutionary move in terms of I don't fit that profile, but it's a statement in terms of like we want the Little Brown list to change because absolutely because of who I am and kind of the works I do and the books that I gravitate towards and also the where I see this list going, the list is going to change. And so to have that opportunity is huge and I don't take it for granted for 1 second. But I would apply all that to writers as well, because I think there is this kind of notion of like there's a certain kind of book that I need to write to a certain audience.
Mm.
And yes, that is true for certain genres, absolutely. Don't get me wrong. And we publish a lot of those books. But I would say don't give up faith that also your unique experience and your point of view and what you're doing is exactly what publishers are looking for. I mean, it may take you a while to find that partner. It may not take the shape and form. Maybe your dream is to be published by Knopf. Maybe it won't be Knopf, but there will be somebody along the way and partnering yourself with the right agent, for example, who can get you in front of the people that know. Um, I think that I would encourage you to not lose, just like, again, I mirror this a lot with kind of how I felt about publishing in the beginning. So, because I know the publishing industry is in some ways kind of seems like you can't break in some ways, but in many ways too, I think it's aligning and keeping working hard on the actual book, but aligning yourself and finding the right partners to help you along the way is really key and to not give up and the market changing or showing itself in different ways that's a new thing and that is ever evolving and that to pay attention to that and see, oh, here's how I fit into that and here's what I bring to the table, and not watering that down or shying away from that is I think really important. So as much as the signals may tell you otherwise, but yeah.
So good, so good. Okay, we need to get off, but I want you to brag about one of your books that's about to release called The Seduction Theory.
Oh,
Um, Such a unique story, an amazing cover. I think I was caught by the cover more than anything, and then got drawn in. You
yeah.
you have 60 seconds for a PSA on that book.
Okay, so it's a great one to lift up because it absolutely a young editor bought it for us. It was shortly after I arrived, and I still say it's one of the best books. I think it's the best book we've bought since I've gotten here because it represents it's upmarket, it's elevated, it will win awards, but it is a page turner. It's fun. It has an amazing plot. It's about two academics who get caught in this sort of untraditional love triangle with a grad student, but it's not what you think. It's what ends up happening. The reveal is that the grad student is actually writing this book as part of her sort of thesis. But it's also a book about love and loyalty and what a longstanding marriage looks like. But and I think for that reason, we've been pitching it as sort of a smart beach read, like a, literary beach
Yeah.
read. And that's the kind of book that absolutely is new for us, a category and a readership that we already published to, but not through a book like this. And so we're hugely excited about it. It's coming out in August, and it's not a debut, by the way. It's by a writer who published a book with a small press before, and really kind of came up with this great conceit. So we've now published or have acquired more books in this area. So you know, that's one, it's to me, it's a pillar for us going forward and the kind of fiction I want Little Brown to be known for.
Wonderful. Sally, thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you for having me.
You have a group of raving fans of you and your good work at Little Brown. Wish you all the best. And again, thank you for joining us. Folks, thanks for joining me. Next month is our guest is an author, Bruce Holsinger, who
Oh,
just had his Oprah book or his book picked by Oprah. So Bruce will be joining us, and will be lots of fun to talk about his work and culpability. So join
did
us
you
in
pick
August.
him before Oprah or was that a Good
Yeah.
time.
So here's a funny story, Sally. I told it originally was to release in October, and I told Cindy Spiegel back in March or April when I read the advanced reading copy, I said, you know what? This is the summer read. Because it's a story about a family going to the beach, going to the lake, I think. Um, and I like to say I was right before Oprah, but I digress.
Good for you. Good for you.
Anyway, thank you, Sally.
Well, thank
Thanks
you again.
everyone for joining us. Take care.
Yeah,
Bye
good luck,
now.
everyone.